maybe to set the stage for starters, right? Like you and I have been talking a lot about what is private equity business development, but maybe to help folks understand a little bit more of like the scale and scope of private equity BD today. Like who has teams today? Like what does the landscape look like? Who has the biggest teams? Like can you give any sort of sense of like the size of this profession today and like how extensive it is inside of private equity?
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to. These are numbers that I'm thinking about looking at every day. So I'm happy to share on it. I guess big picture, there's just about 800 people that actually have this role. And the way that I think about it is people who would define their position as dedicated sourcing professionals, whether you call it business development, you call it deal origination, sourcing, someone whose full-time job is thinking about finding an investment opportunity. And that's to be differentiated with obviously the deal teams and other folks and other functions at PE firms. So just thinking about those dedicated folks, 800, just about 800 in the US at private equity firms, family offices, independent sponsors.
That's a little surprising, right? I mean, like when you look at the industry, at least, I think Accenture said last year that there was like 10,000 private equity firms. I think the count that I usually use is like somewhere between 6 and 8,000, private equity firms. And so we're saying like there's out of that, there's only 800 professionals total.
Yeah, I mean it's a function that's in its early stages, I'd say, as far as how common it is to have a dedicated business development professional. So I think there's a lot of growth ahead. We'll talk about kind of predictions and trends that are taking place, but there are a lot of firms that don't have a single dedicated BD professional, and we've talked about this. Maybe it's not an absolute requirement for every firm to have a team of sourcing professionals. It really depends on your investment strategy, what type of companies you're going after, and what's the best way to get in front of them. But certainly, we've seen firms that have been at the forefront of building these teams have continued to do so. So there's definitely a good ROI on that investment and hiring these folks.
Those 800 though, like that's people, right? Like that's not firms.
Yeah, so it's just about half that. So it's just under 400 by our most recent count of actual firms that have at least one dedicated BD professional. But just kind of tailing back to your first question, if you look at like the league tables, the biggest teams in the industry, they do a lot of that hiring, or I should say, of that 800. A lot of them work at the top 10 biggest teams in the industry. Alpine is by far the largest team. They've got about 40, in the low 40s of dedicated business development professionals. And that's 2 or 3 times the next largest team. So that is they've put the most resources in place. That team is split between folks that are solely reaching out to companies doing proprietary sourcing, their direct team. And then they have a team that focuses on intermediary coverage. And then from there, you've got the Riverside company, which has been around and doing this for a while. They've got 16 people, give or take. HIG has a team of 12. LLR has a team of 12. Vista, Percheron, Sarant, Trivest are all in that and 10, 11, 12 dedicated BD professionals. And so those are definitely the largest teams out there. And I think those are also the firms that you think of that have maybe the best in class sourcing functions. But it's interesting to see the firms that have been at the forefront have continued to allocate towards building these teams out.
Interesting. I mean, we're talking about, so it's less than 6%. I mean, I was looking at 400 out of, call it 7,000. It's like less than 6% of firms that like have any sort of dedicated function. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so we talk to firms that are thinking about their first hires all the time. It's definitely become more of a common talking point, surrounding fundraising. Like, how are you differentiating your firm from a sourcing perspective? So I think there will be some catch up, over the next couple of years. But it is, it's interesting to see that it's a smaller fraction than maybe you'd think.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like, out of that, call it 800 people, you've got some that are, at these firms, like you said, the Alpine, Sarant, Trivest, Riversides of the world, where there's, some decent sized teams, right? And so maybe they've got 10 to 20, and it sounds like up to 40 plus sort of people. What about like, so it's are the balance or the majority of those 800 folks spread, like more thinly across a number of firms? Like, what's the average size of a BD team? Like, are we talking like, I mean, I would assume like maybe it's 2 to 5 people. I don't know. Like, what have you seen in terms of the average for somebody that's established it? Like, how big are those functions now?
Sure. So of that 400 or so firms that at least we've identified that have any number of dedicated BD people,
Yeah.
the largest cohort of that is about 230 firms have just one person. So it's very common just
200
to
firms
hire.
just have one person.
Yeah, 230 by our count
Wow.
just have one person
Okay.
in the role. I think for a lot of firms, that's made sense. It's kind of like, let's have one person just manage our relationships, just be the person who's thinking about the pipeline and deal sourcing. And then some firms who started that way have just added resources, more coverage, or someone who kind of handles the admin responsibilities. But yeah, it's there are firms that have dedicated towards it, but are I think still in the early stages.
So, I mean, one of the things that we started to do, while I was at Saren is like we started to add other roles into the function too, right? Like when I started, we just, kind of had just sourcing folks, but over time, like we expanded into, marketing, and I hired, sales out, like sourcing operations, all that sort of stuff. Like what are the different, like what do the teams look like today? Obviously, it sounds like there's 200 of them. That's just like one person, but for the ones that have kind of been built out a little bit more, like what does that function look like, and what are the different roles?
Yeah, you see a confluence of different approaches towards building teams. So in some scenarios, it's like Alpine teams by sourcing strategy or sourcing channel. So an intermediary coverage team and a proprietary team. And you'll see smaller teams do the same thing, where you have one person who will cover banks, another person who will cover a different channel, one proprietary. That certainly is something that happens frequently. But then you'll just see other teams that share a mix of responsibilities or coverage areas. Trivest, for instance, has a regional approach. So while they have a handful of people that are in their HQ in Miami, they have one individual that's in a number of cities across the U.S. and into Canada. And so different approaches to it. I think most of the time it comes down to coverage. And so the additional team members will take a new share, a new channel. What's newer to BD, I would say, are the folks that are coming on to do things like like the data specific hires to clean up their data, to enrich their data, to try to do kind of advanced data driven sourcing. Folks have there's always been admin resources to kind of manage the CRM and do some of the data implementation or inputting, but I think there are some firms that are looking to do a bit more.
So other than this development of perhaps a data-driven sourcing and like, the equivalent of revenue ops or sales ops, what I called sourcing ops inside of the function, what other trends are you seeing? Like what else is evolving in the way of roles or like the makeup of teams? Have you seen anything kind of change there, either in the data or kind of anecdotally over time?
I mean, I think the shift towards proprietary sourcing has certainly been prevalent in the past couple of years. The conversations that we've had surrounding additional BD hires to either start or expand the proprietary channel, that's been really common. And if you look at just some of the names that we just went through, like the biggest BD teams, there's a good share of those teams that are focusing solely on proprietary sourcing. So there might just be something there, right, where the universe of companies and the ability to do direct outreach is vast, and so one approach is hire a big team to try to cover it. But that's probably, in addition to just we've had one person, two people for a long time, and we feel like there are so many contacts, and so let's add another person to kind of expand the coverage or take some of the share from the first two people. I'd say those are two of the most frequent examples we see.
Right. Okay. And what about like, again, like this function's newer, right? In general at private equity firms, we just talked about the fact that like, less than 6% of firms even have any sort of dedicated function. And I'm like, at least in my perspective, that's been growing and changing over time. But like, what about like the levels and seniority and kind of background mix of those folks? Like, what does that look like? And have you seen that? Is that changing at all over time?
Still a relatively new area for us to have like covered as closely as we are now. So, we don't have the benefit of years of looking back at the evolution, but I think one of the things we'll talk about today is like the relatively recent strategy of hiring folks out of sales backgrounds and kind of taking that approach towards structuring compensation packages that are like metric driven. And so, I think if you look at the share of all of the 800 or so people that are in these roles, it's like, I think it's somewhere in the 12% come out of sales backgrounds. And again, I can't tell you the increase over year for that, but anecdotally, that it seems like that is a more desired background, or at least a background that folks are open to more often today.
It's interesting, right? Like I at least my experience, it has been in the private equity space, like the sourcing function is newer, right? Like it's not something that's, I mean, it has existed, but like, it's still in its nascency, right? Like it's still developing. And the thing that's, I guess, been surprising to me a lot is kind of to the point of what you just brought up, is that like private equity firms haven't necessarily across the board universally adopted sales best practices yet, right? Or like go to market strategies in a lot of cases, like we've talked about. And so like, to me, that makes a ton of sense, right? Like we're just in the beginning phases of like effectively adopting sales best practices and bringing in sales professionals, into the private equity space.
I think so too. I think we'll continue to see that share grow, or just like firms that are open to that. Just the quick breakdown of all of the business development professionals out there by just years of experience, like how senior they are. The largest share is 15 to 20 plus, or 15 plus years of experience. Most senior folks, it's about 37% of that 800 number. And then just going down the line, it's just under 20% that have 10 to 14 years, about 22% that have 6 to 9 years, and then it's 23% that have 1 to 5 years.
The biggest bucket is still like the folks that are deeply experienced in this.
Yeah, and that could be a product of early hires. It seems like were partners at firms, or were folks that were on the deal team that just kind of assumed the responsibilities. Those, a lot of the kind of OGs in the BD role, were folks that were on the deal side, or doing deals before they took that over. Yep. A lot of what we hear about is adding junior resources today. So these numbers might change next year or over time, but that's what it stands like today.